Here at Fourth Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge by co-creating daily activities that examine research questions and projects in development across the university. We are running today's event as a live stream to YouTube and as a Zoom meeting. For those of you joining us on Zoom, we welcome your comments and questions with a raised hand via the chat. And for those of you in the space, we welcome your comments and questions. If you'd like to participate, just let us know by raising a hand and we'll be sure to get this microphone to you. With that, I would love to hand things over to Associate Professor in Contemporary Dance, Concordia University Research Chair in Ecologies of Black Performance, and Special Advisor to the Provost Office, Black Integration and Knowledges, Angelique Wilkie. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm not going to be here long. I'm just going to say thanks to Fourth Space for hosting this entire academic year of events. And thank you to these amazing people who have said yes to sitting behind this table today. This is session 4 of 5 events, really spread out over the course of the academic year. And the intention really is to bring to the surface, to render visible the Black Studies work that is already going on at Concordia. I'm thrilled to say that whatever you've missed is on YouTube and is on the Fourth Space virtual repository. So there's always a way to reestablish contact with what has not been witnessed in person. And anybody interested in furthering conversations around different forms that Black Studies can take and that they already exist potentially in our university, I'm more than open to continuing those conversations. So feel free to get in touch. On that note, Amaechi.
Okafor. I'm a doctoral student in history, and I'll be the moderator for this series. I have here Dr. Nicola Smith and Tesfa Peterson. Dr. Nicola Smith is an assistant professor of biology at Concordia University, where she studies climate change, impacts on marine systems, marine invasions, and their interactions. She is an associate editor for New Biodata, a peer-reviewed open access journal on biological invasions. She is also an editorial board member for Discover Oceans, a new open access journal on all fields related to oceanography and marine sciences. Tesfa Peterson. Tesfa Peterson is currently a PhD student in the Humanities department at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. Her current work, tentatively titled Diaspora, Reverberations, and Community Groundings, engages a praxis of grassroots community transformation through education, as espoused in the work of Caribbean intellectual Walter Rodney. I'm going to go ahead to read the Anti-Black Racism and Black Inclusion statement written by Dr. Delores V. Mullins, offered to the inaugural Interinstitutional Forum of the Scarborough Charter on Anti-Black Racism and Black Inclusion in Canadian Higher Education, May 2022, Vancouver, Canada. We call upon our ancestors, remember all who came before us. We honor you, our African ancestors, who paved the way for us in the diaspora and in the motherland, cradle of civilization, Mother Africa. Your bodies, blood, flesh, and bones, then and now, nourish the earth and color great and small. Fresh and salted waters, African, Caribbean, and Black people, no matter where in the world we are, share a common bond of courage, determination, indomitable spirit, and greatness. And we acknowledge our differences and similarities embedded in the bloodlines of kings and queens, inventors, warriors, and philosophers. Some of you endured the brutality of transatlantic enslavement, forced to give free labor, built nation states worldwide in bare backs, and still managed to be victorious in achievements. We honor you today and call upon your wounded and triumphant spirits to share this space and bask in our glory of you. All our four mothers, fathers, parents, and relations, we know that you fought alongside indigenous peoples yesteryear for freedom. So we know that our liberation is tied to the liberation of indigenous peoples across Turtle Island and the world. We cannot ever be liberated if our indigenous relations remain in bondage under the tyranny of historical and modern colonialism. We will not let your toil and service to humanity and to Black people go in vain. So carry on in your footsteps, reaching for higher heights, creating memories and deeper prints for those of us here, now, and babes unfertilized yet to come. I'll go ahead and allow Dr. Nicola S. Smith present her research.
Thanks. Good afternoon. Today I'm going to talk about drivers of environmental change in the oceans, which also happens to be the title of my research lab here at Concordia. But before I get started, I'd like to talk a bit about myself and what inspires me as a marine ecologist. Because I was born and raised in the Bahamas, the oceans have always been a very big part of my everyday life. And so too have invasive species. My first introduction to invasive species occurred when I was very young. The casuarina trees you see in this photo are invasive throughout many parts of the world. In the Bahamas, they are ubiquitous, particularly on beaches where they cause shoreline erosion. Many years later, I was confronted with the Indo-Pacific lionfish invasion on Caribbean coral reefs. The idea that a non-native species could wreak ecological havoc and dominate a land or seascape, however, was not new to me, as I've just shown. But what was different was that I was now in the position to do something about it, as at the time, I was searching for a topic to study for graduate school. And so began my career studying invasive species in our oceans. Another focus of my research thus far is the problem of overexploitation of marine resources. Fishing is of social and cultural importance in the Bahamas. In fact, the children you see fishing for fun in this photo are Israel and Amani, the children of my childhood friend. And the sign Fish Fry Drive that you see in this photo from a popular place for locals to socialize and eat fresh seafood refers to frying fish in a pan to eat in the Bahamas. Fishing is also of economic importance in the Bahamas. Here you see a picture of the Caribbean spiny lobster, the most valuable fisheries export in a small island state. But some of these fisheries are overexploited. The typical Bahamian is aware of this simply by observing the rising cost and dropping availability of local seafood. However, it was not until I met Dr. Daniel Pauly at the University of British Columbia and a Sea Around project on reconstructing marine fisheries catches for the entire world that I get involved in digging up historical records to understand the true scope of fisheries exploitation through time. And finally, climate change affects us all, but particularly those in small island states in the Caribbean, where it sits in a hurricane belt where the intensity of storms are predicted to increase. What really drove me to get involved with this issue from a research perspective was when I observed the devastation caused by Category 5 Hurricane Dorian, which hit the Bahamas in 2019, killing over 200 people, displacing tens of thousands more, and costing about $3.4 billion in damages, which is equal to 1/4 of the Bahamas' GDP. So my motivation for studying 3 major drivers of global environmental change as it relates to ocean sustainability is therefore deeply personal. We'll start off with invasive species. Now here I use the Indo-Pacific lionfish invasion on Caribbean coral reefs as a model system to show how native predators can reduce the success of invasive species through non-lethal means. Now, lionfish are native to the Indian and Pacific Oceans, where they're mid-level predators on coral reefs and eat a variety of smaller fishes and crustaceans. They were first introduced into the Western Atlantic Ocean in the mid-1980s off the coast of Florida via the aquarium trade. And you'll see these little red dots on the screen that will show the gradual spread of the invasion throughout the Western Atlantic. And things are really going to take off when they hit the Bahamas in 2004. And this invasion is really important for me because the Bahamas has the highest densities of lionfish in both the native and invaded ranges. Fast forward to 2026, and lionfish are now found as far north as North Carolina in the USA and as far south as Brazil, although this somewhat dated map only shows the distributions as of May 2021. Now, people are concerned about the lionfish invasion because lionfish are incredibly effective predators. For instance, in some coral reefs in the Bahamas, lionfish predation has resulted in 65% declines in native prey fish abundances on natural reefs. And it seems as if they have no natural form of biological control because they have these venomous spines along their back and along their belly. So you can imagine people's surprise when this paper appeared in Coral Reefs Journal, showing that large groupers can in fact eat small lionfish. However, this was an opportunistic observation involving only 6 groupers, 3 of which had small lionfish in their stomachs. And this takes me to my question of whether native groupers can act as a form of biological resistance to lionfish. Now, there is currently conflicting evidence about the nature of the relationship between lionfish and native groupers in the Caribbean. For example, at the local scale of a marine protected area in the Bahamas, lionfish abundance or biomass was found to be negatively correlated with grouper biomass, as shown here with grouper biomass on the x-axis and lionfish biomass on the y. However, at much larger spatial scales, such as this study involving 3 ecoregions throughout the Caribbean, there was no correlation between lionfish and grouper abundances. Unlike previous studies that examined the correlation between lionfish and native grouper abundances, I decided to look for the answer straight from the grouper's mouth. Yes, pun intended. To do this, I examined the stomach contents of over 200 large-bodied groupers representing 6 species that were caught by the commercial and recreational fishers on 3 islands throughout the Bahamian archipelago. And what did I find? Not a single lionfish, thus showing that there was little support for direct predation of groupers or lionfish. But direct consumption is only half of the effect that predators can have on potential prey. There's also a large body of literature that shows non-consumptive or fair or non-lethal effects, in which the mere presence of predators can cause prey to alter their behaviors so that it's more difficult for predators to detect, encounter, or capture prey. For example, cats for the most part eat cat food, but mice will still be afraid and hide when cats are around. And this anti-predator behavior by mice also comes at a cost, as mice that spend more time hiding have potentially less time to forage for food and mate. Some species of groupers in the Caribbean are of similar size and eat similar prey as lionfish, and can therefore potentially compete with lionfish on reefs as a form of biological resistance. I examined the non-consumptive or non-lethal and competitive effects of native groupers on invasive lionfish by conducting a field experiment on coral reef patches around Eleuthera Island in the Bahamas, in which I exploited natural variability in grouper densities. And so those little circles there are patch reefs. Now, the first thing I did was I cleared all reefs of lionfish and replaced them with tagged juvenile lionfish that I collected from outside of the study area. Each reef therefore contained 3 to 4 lionfish in which I could identify individuals. And if you see these little blue dots, if you look very closely, you'll see a little orange sort of bar. So those are visible implant elastomer tags. And what's really cool about these is that it comes in a liquid form and you inject it just under the skin of lionfish, and then it hardens really quickly within seconds. And what's really cool about this is that they fluoresce really brightly under UV light. And so when I'm diving for lionfish, a lot of the studies took place at dawn, which is defined as 1 hour before sunrise and 1 hour after sunrise. So when you're diving on the reef, it's completely black. It's completely dark there. And so how we find lionfish is I have an underwater UV light, flashlight, and I basically strobe the reef. And suddenly these bright colors would pop out at me, and depending on the color, the combination of colors and their location on the fish, I can identify individuals. So I can say, oh, that's N2347. So I monitor the abundances of groupers and native fish small enough to be lionfish prey on reefs every other week for 1.5 months. using underwater visual surveys and a method what we call transects, which is just a line that you run over the coral reef, and then you swim very slowly over that line and record every single fish that you see, their size, their species, and their abundances. Now, I also recorded a series of lionfish anti-predator behaviors on reefs every 30 seconds for 30 minutes per fish, per survey, both at dawn and throughout the day. Now, these behavioral studies also took place over a period of 1.5 months. Now, I measured 3 anti-predator behaviors by lionfish. These were hiding, inactivity, and total swimming distance. However, given time constraints, I'll only present my results looking at lionfish hiding behavior today. Now, I also examined several other factors that might influence lionfish behaviors. So these included large body groupers based on species or size, smaller body groupers, which can be competitors to lionfish, and other lionfish that also compete with one another, as well as time of day, which is at dawn or in the daytime. I looked at several lionfish anti-predator behaviors, like hiding, as shown here, and then I formulated numerous hypotheses or working ideas based on factors that I thought might influence lionfish behaviors. These hypotheses were then rewritten as mathematical models, which I then competed against each other to see which model had the most support in the data using a statistical approach called information theory. So here's one of my key results. Specifically, after competing 20 different models related to lionfish hiding using maximum likelihood, I found that the top or the best model turned out to be this very simple one, where I have grouper predator density on the x-axis and the probability that a lionfish is hiding at first sighting at dawn on the y-axis. Now, if you understand a little bit about statistics, the bands you see are the 95% confidence intervals, while the points are jittered along the y-axis and indicate where the lionfish was observed hiding within a reef, as signified by the number 1, or out in the open, as signified by a 0. As you can see, the higher the grouper predator density on reefs, the more likely a lionfish was to be hiding at dawn when they should otherwise be hunting. Now, this model explained 60% of variation in lionfish hunting behaviors at dawn. Now, I won't show the results for the other lionfish behaviors that I measured, but suffice to say that lionfish were more likely to hide and be inactive at dawn when they should otherwise be hunting on reefs with high abundances of groupers. Large groupers are overfished throughout most of the Caribbean, which can therefore give rise to bolder lionfish that are more effective predators on native species. But taking a step back from this specific study, what do these findings mean in the broader sense of things? Well, large predators are in decline worldwide, causing large-scale disruptions to ecosystem structure and function. But most people only focus on the consequences of the loss of consumptive effects of predators. Here, I show that the depletion of large predators can have implications that go beyond demographic effects on prey, and can also, in fact, alter prey behaviors. Okay, let's take a bit of a breather and enjoy this beautiful coral reef photo in the Bahamas. I'll now present some of my past work on overexploitation of marine resources. Now, if you were to base current management decisions on officially reported fisheries catch statistics for the Bahamas, you would immediately picture this: a fleet of small-scale artisanal commercial fishing vessels in Spanish Wells Eleuthera, the largest fishing community in the Bahamas. But my research has shown that this is literally only half of the story. What you should also be thinking about is this: the massive volume of fish that is removed from Bahamian waters each year by tourists engaged in recreational fishing. Now, tourism became a major force in the Bahamas when it became year-round in the early 1950s, believe it or not, with the advent of air conditioning, which made hanging out in the Bahamas in the summer something that people would want to do. So since then, since the 1950s, the number of visitors to the Bahamas each year has grown substantially, so that tourists now outnumber residents by an order of magnitude. As you can see there, By the year 2010, you had about 5.1 million tourists to less than 500,000 local residents. Now, many of these tourists come to relax and enjoy sunbathing in beautiful places like this famous sandbar, the Exuma Keys, the Bahamas. But thousands also come each year specifically to do this: recreational fishing, in which our fish are caught for pleasure and may or may not be consumed. Now, before I go any further, I'd like to show you this figure of the officially reported catch data for the Bahamas, which comprises exclusively commercial fisheries. All other sectors, such as recreational and subsistence fishing, are missing. Here we have time on the x-axis, while we have fisheries catches in metric tons on the y. Now, these data are important because they are used to make management decisions both locally and internationally, and are submitted each year to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, or the FAO, which records fisheries catches for the entire world. So how does one determine the importance of marine recreational fishing relative to other sectors when, like many countries, the Bahamas presently only accounts for commercial landings in their official statistics? Well, one solution is to use the established and widely applied catch reconstruction approach developed by Dr. Daniel Pauly and Zirk Deller at UBC. In my work, I applied the 7 steps involved in catch reconstruction as presented here. In a nutshell, you first identify existing data, and then you identify missing components using alternative information sources such as the colonial reports for the Bahamas or newspaper clippings. You can basically fill in these missing components with something that we call data anchor points. And then what you do is you linearly interpolate between anchor points to basically recreate an entire catch series. And then you use the reported catch with the unreported catch, you combine the two together, and then finally you express some uncertainty in the data sources that you use using a framework developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So to cut a very long story short, at the end of my reconstruction, I showed that the total amount of fish removed from Bahamian waters over the past half century was 2.6 times the officially reported statistics. Even more alarming is the fact that recreational fishing, shown here in light green, accounted for more of half the total reconstructed catch, in which most unreported catch from this sector was taken by tourists. Thus, by ignoring recreational catches in the Bahamas, you are literally missing half of the story on fishing. My findings therefore debunk a common misperception in the Bahamas and globally that catches from recreational fisheries are relatively small and thus negligible when compared to other major sectors. Hence, we should also be recording recreational catch, not just commercial fisheries, at the FAO level. Now, recreational catch constituted roughly half of reconstructed total catch and is closely linked to tourism in small island states. Furthermore, despite gear and bag limits, the large number of participants in this fishery results in significant impacts on species and stocks that are currently unaccounted for in official data. But my story doesn't end there. This story also had a big impact on society. I believe that your work is not done when you publish a paper. Instead, you must also disseminate these findings using popular media. And if you're lucky, you may even be able to influence policy. So after the publication of the study, I was invited by the Bahamian government to be a part of their official delegation to attend the 32nd Committee of Fisheries in Rome at the United Nations FAO. There, I presented my findings on the importance of recreational catch in the Bahamas at a side event on fishery statistics and its importance for food security. My reconstructed recreational catch data were eventually officially endorsed by the Bahamian government and retroactively submitted to the FAO for the years 1950 through 2010. I also currently updated these statistics to, I think, the year 2024, and all this data is publicly available on the Sea Around Us website, so anyone can download it for free. So, in other words, this study literally rewrote the history of fishing in the Bahamas and set new baselines for fisheries management. Okay, let's take another breather here and look at another coral reef in the Bahamas. Now I'm going to talk to you about climate change in Caribbean coral reefs and how it can interact with invasive species to worsen an ecological problem. And this study here was done at Concordia since I arrived by some of my master's students. Now, coral reefs make up less than 1% of the ocean floor, but are home to 25% of all known marine life. These systems are incredibly rich in biodiversity, and yet, due to a variety of factors, they are among the most threatened ecosystems on the planet. Now, the dominant threat to coral reefs is climate change. The oceans absorb between 20 to 30% of carbon dioxide emissions generated by human activity, and about 90% of excess heat produced by global warming. This results in a series of physical changes that affect the oceans in various ways, from rising sea levels and increasing sea temperatures, to changes in ocean circulation and ocean chemistry, and to increases in the intensity and frequency of extreme events like hurricanes and marine heat waves. In fact, marine heat waves are increasing globally in frequency, intensity, and duration because of climate change. As shown here, the annual number of marine heat wave days has been increasing in recent years globally. And this trend holds regionally in the Caribbean, where since 1980, marine heat waves have increased 5-fold in frequency and have doubled in duration. But what does warming waters have to do with invasive species like lionfish? Well, because fish depend on the external environment to regulate their body temperatures, increasing water temperatures result in an increase in fish metabolic rate, or the rate of cellular processes that allow for the maintenance and growth of an organism. So this increase in energy demand due to an increasing metabolism must be met by increasing energy intake in the form of food. And that's where lionfish come in. Lionfish are already effective predators on coral reefs in the Caribbean. As I've shown, they've already reduced native fish by 65% in current day conditions. So does increasing ocean temperatures due to climate change also increase lionfish predation and basically exacerbate the negative impact that they're having on native species? And that's pretty much what I ask here. To answer this question, my former master's student, she's now my former student, she just graduated a few months ago. Caitlin Moffat, she graduated from here in Concordia. We're going to show some of her work that she did for her thesis. So Katie and I used a lab experiment to quantify the predatory behaviors of invasive lionfish and the anti-predator behaviors of native parrotfish under ocean warming. Now, why parrotfish? Well, one common prey of lionfish are juvenile princess and striped parrotfish. Now, parrotfish are what we call keystone herbivores, where they help control the overall health of coral reefs by controlling the growth of algae that would otherwise overgrow and smother reefs. Parrotfish populations are already decreasing from human causes like overfishing and habitat degradation. The additional pressure of an effective predator like lionfish can therefore potentially cause cascading effects in coral reef ecosystems. So we did this research at the Cape Eleuthera Institute on Eleuthera Island in the Bahamas, where we used adult lionfish and locally abundant juvenile princess and striped parrotfish, where Katie and some of her master's students had to learn to capture fish from the wild on reefs, and that took them a little bit of a while. It was a challenging experience, and some tears were had, but they got it done. Many frantic phone calls actually I got from the Bahamas while I was in Montreal about capturing these fish, which was step one of the project. But they did it, they came through. So they live captured lionfish and parrotfish from nearby coral reefs and put them in 75-gallon tanks. Lionfish and parrotfish were separated from each other using a transparent and opaque barriers. Shelter was also provided for each of the lionfish and the parrotfish, so you can see the little rocks in the picture there, the little PVC pipes, those are shelters. We then gradually increased the temperature in half of the tanks over a series of days to 32 degrees Celsius, which was the ocean temperature in the Bahamas in 2024 during a marine heat wave. The other half of the temperatures remain at normal levels, which was about 29 degrees Celsius. And we then performed a series of behavioral trials. I should point out that while we were doing this study, another heat wave was going on in the Bahamas. We're actually in the 4th mass global bleaching event, which means that corals in every ocean in the world are currently bleaching because of warming waters. And so what happened during this experiment, we were in the middle of this global heat wave. And so although we had to raise the temperature of the water in the tanks to 32 degrees Celsius, in the water, naturally, it was at already 31 degrees Celsius, so we had to raise it by 1 degree to get it to 32. And then what we had to do was to maintain that 29 degrees Celsius temperature, which should have been average temperatures. I actually luckily had the foresight to say, what happens if we're in a marine heat wave? And I had bought a series of chillers. And so we actually had to put chillers into these tanks to bring the temperature down to 29 degrees Celsius because of climate change. So now these trials occurred at dawn and at midday. And observational studies were recorded on GoPro cameras and were analyzed later after the field season. So for these trials, the opaque barrier between the predator and the prey were removed at the start of the trial so the fish could both see each other and smell each other. We then used a scan technique to record the behaviors of lionfish and parrotfish every 30 seconds for 30 minutes. Once trials were over, we replaced the opaque barrier. For lionfish behaviors, we looked at swimming, which we defined as actively swimming in any direction. We did hovering, which is stationary in the water column. Resting, defined as stationary at the bottom of the tank or against any form of cover. And finally, hunting, which is a specific posture lionfish adopt when hunting, when they spread their pectoral fins, which are the big, beautiful fan-like fins on the side of their bodies, and their dorsal spines, which are those beautiful spines on their back, which are actually highly venomous. I don't recommend getting stung by them. I've been stung twice doing lionfish in my career, and it's very painful. And what they do is they basically spread out these fins, and then they lock onto the prey, and they will hover over the prey very closely. And then if you didn't have that barrier between them, they would basically open their mouth, it would shoot out, and it would engulf the prey. I couldn't get the lionfish to eat the prey in this experiment because animal care were not pleased with that. So we had to just look at the behaviors. So here's the lionfish in the tank. And if you watch, you can see it's basically spreading out its fins and spreading out the spines on its back. It sees the prey. It's locking in on the parrotfish. I don't know if you can see them. They're quite small. They were darting up and down, and now they're hiding behind the rock. And the lionfish is basically going to sit there for half an hour trying to get at this prey. You see him darting. You see the little prey darted in and out just now. So that darting behavior is also an anti-predator behavior. So we also recorded the parrotfish behaviors as well. But due to time constraints, I'll only show you some of the results from the lionfish behaviors. So here I present the data in which each plot represents a lionfish behavior, like the 4 behaviors we just talked about. The blues represent the number of behaviors displayed by each fish over 30 minutes in the normal temperature, so in the 29 degrees Celsius tanks, at dawn and at midday, while the red and the orange represent lionfish behaviors in hot tanks at dawn and at midday. As you can see, lionfish rested less in the hot tanks at midday, which makes sense because what they were also doing at midday was they were hunting more, which is consistent with what we predicted, that lionfish would feed more under elevated temperatures. So like I said before, we measured a whole bunch of parrotfish behaviors, including aggression and feeding and all these other things, but I don't have time to go into that today, but you can see me afterwards if you want to find out what they've done. That paper is actually currently in review right now at a journal. But what I want to step back and say about this is generally what we found was that lionfish hunted more in hot tanks than in normal temperature tanks, while parrotfish spent more time foraging in hot tanks because parrotfish are herbivores, so they need to eat more as well when the temperatures escalate. And so this is concerning because by lionfish hunting more And parrotfish, because they're out in the open feeding more, they're actually increasing the time in which they're exposed to potential predation, and the predation levels have been elevated as well. And so if these lionfish hunting behaviors result substantially in increased parrotfish mortality, this could result in increased algal growth on reefs, because it basically released that control that parrotfish were having over the growth of algae, and this would result in killing the coral. And if coral die, this negatively affects all the organisms, including humans, that depend on them for survival. So this summer, we're going back to the Bahamas, and hopefully Animal Care will give us the approval to let the lionfish eat the parrotfish, so we can actually see whether the scales down to primary productivity on reefs, whether elevated temperatures interacting with the invasive species basically goes down the food web and affects primary productivity, or the amount of algae you see on reefs. So that's fingers crossed that that permit is in review right now. Hopefully we'll get it. But what I also want to do, I'm going to close off by highlighting the work done by my undergraduate honors student, Amaechi, who actually, I want to point out, his work is now published in the journal Marine Biology. So as an undergraduate, just working with me for 2 semesters, he did such great work that it was published in a really reputable peer-reviewed journal. Now, what Amaechi did was he used lionfish videos from the experiments that I just showed you. So he used Katie's videos, because they were on GoPros. And he used machine learning to quantify lionfish predatory behavior, so artificial intelligence. So basically, he built a bunch of models using artificial intelligence to quantify these lionfish behaviors. And what he did was he performed his AI, he basically compared the performance of his artificial intelligence models to human observations, or to natural intelligence, so basically to the recordings that Katie did. And basically what he found was that AI was really good at capturing hunting and swimming behaviors, but they didn't do so well at looking at hovering and resting behaviors for a variety of reasons. So his model is still pretty good, and the code is available and is easily modified to different medium-bodied species. And so it's a really cool development. And yes, so that is live. It's published, and the code is live, and it's all reproducible. Unfortunately, he's now in dental school, but he would have made a fantastic ecologist. So hopefully you've gotten a sense of some of the works the students and I do related to 3 major drivers of environmental change in the oceans. And on that note, I'd like to close by thanking my funders, and also thanking you for your attention.
Thank you.
I'd also like to thank my lab, which is just a little over 2 years old, but many of the students in my lab in such a short amount of time have done so much work and have made my life as an assistant professor both challenging but highly rewarding. Thank you.
We thank Dr. Nicola Smith for that presentation. Now we'll go to Tesfa Peterson for her presentation.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My presentation this afternoon is on work that is ongoing as part of my PhD project that I've titled Speculative Storytelling as Caribbean Method, Village Knowledge, Archival Silences, and Repertory Futures. I will not do as great a job with PowerPoint. I am in awe of your PowerPointing, Dr. Smith. But what I'm going to talk about will be delivered more in the mode of a talk, and if I remember, I'll move the PowerPoint along at some point. So thank you again, and good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be part of this very important moment for Concordia at the launch of Concordia's minor in Black and African Diaspora Studies in the Canadian context. I believe that this marks something significant for us who belong to the university, but also to the broader intellectual community in Montreal and elsewhere. And that making space for Black thought, for Black history, and for Black futures is not a marginal kind of add-on to existing disciplines, but that it is central to our frameworks for understanding the world. My work sits within a Caribbean intellectual tradition that asks difficult questions about how knowledge is produced in spaces and places that are shaped by slavery, colonialism, and migration in these contexts. In these contexts, the archive records violence very precisely in what Catherine McKittrick would call a mathematics of life. We get data on who was owned, who received compensation, who held power, but frequently what the records fail to account for are relationships, memories, everyday practices through which communities sustain themselves. So this afternoon, I want to think with a simple question, one that has guided my work up until now. And the question asks, how do we produce scholarship that feels like a village? And what I mean by that is, what would it mean for research, teaching, archival work that reflects the ways knowledge circulates in many Black and Caribbean communities, through everyday conversations, through memory, through landscape, through rumor and storytelling? Speculative storytelling, in my sort of humble estimation, is one way that we can potentially meet this challenge. And my thinking around speculative storytelling is informed by a rich intellectual tradition in Caribbean thought, in the work of Mal Collins, whose important work of recovery and retrieval of Black Grenadian feminist histories is at the center of my PhD project. Erna Broadber's work in her Jamaican village of Woodside, which offers us a method and a methodology of how the village operates as a reparatory epistemology. Edward Glissant, who has given us relation, opacity, and errantry as modes of thinking the post-colonial landscape. Catherine McKittrick, who, drawing on Glissant's work, speaks of Black feminist affective landscapes as one of the ways that we recover thinking around how our epistemologies survive, and Sylvia Winter, who asked us to rethink the category of the human entirely. Across this work, we see a shared challenge. How do we think about knowledge in contexts where history has been violently fragmented? As we know, those of us who are from the Caribbean here, the Caribbean is a space that is marked by histories of slavery, colonialism, migration, and displacement. And despite these ruptures, communities have developed powerful ways of holding memory, of holding relation, and of holding their knowledges together. Yes. And so, beautiful, perfect timing too. This is the one. And one of the places that we see these tensions become visible is when we think with the colonial archive. The colonial archive records certain kinds of information really well, information about property, about ownership, about compensation, and about economic value. I'm thinking here specifically with one kind of archive, the UCL, the University College London Legacies of British Slavery database, that documents compensation paid to slave owners after abolition. What we don't get in these archives is often how relationality and relationship, particularly the voices of enslaved people, are often missing from these records. So in these records, we see how much money was paid to enslavers in the post-emancipation British Caribbean, how many enslaved people were claimed. I mean, if you go into the archive, I encourage you to do that when you have some time. I think I have it here somewhere, where to go. And you'll see that in the archive, enslaved people are data points. They are framed as claims. We can see, for example, my work is in Grenada and about Grenada, and when you go into the UCL database and you write in Grenada, you see a list of last check 692 different claims that came from an island of 133 square miles after emancipation. What these archives don't tell us is about the lives of those enslaved people, about their kinship networks, their stories, or their descendants. The archive quantifies violence and silences relation. And as an example of this, I have the example of what I call fantastical tales of colonial repair in the case of the Trevelyan family and their relationship to Grenada. So I'm going to play just a little bit of this, the opening to this.
For over 200 years, Grenada was at the heart of the transatlantic slave trade, a colony of Britain and France. In the wake of the racial reckoning in the US, across the Caribbean there are growing calls for the colonial powers to pay reparations for slavery. Members of the royal family touring Jamaica were met with demands for Britain's government to apologise for its role in the slave trade. My family in England owned slaves here on Grenada, and though we never set foot on the island, we profited from the sale of sugar, and when slavery was finally abolished, we got compensation from the British government. The slaves got nothing. Now Grenada is debating the idea of reparations for slavery and what that means. I've come here to confront the past and to ask how it shapes the future. I felt apprehensive as we began exploring Grenada, not knowing what I'd discover or how my quest to unearth the past would be received.
One of the things that the British government asked for was for the planters to say how many slaves they owned and to make a record of how many were born, how many died each year. So Grenada actually has some of the best records.
Nicola.
I'm going to stop there for the sake of time, but this is a documentary that's available on YouTube. It's a BBC documentary, and I'm going to talk just a little bit about what you just saw there. So this is a woman by the name of Laura Trevelyan. She is a British, she was part of the British Broadcasting Network. She has since quit her job there and has renamed or recast herself as a reparations advocate. And if you go into the database, we can see easily, if you type in the name Trevelyan, you can see all of the ancestors that are connected to the Trevelyans. I believe there are 9 people's names tied to claims in the University College London database. And I've had my students at Dawson do this as an assignment now for the last 3 or so years. And one of the things that I asked them to do is to do the calculation in today's money, how much money her family received at emancipation. And it's to the tune of $9+ million in today's money that the Trevelyans received. While, so a few years ago in 2023, I believe, maybe a little bit earlier than that, Laura came to Grenada and did this, as you see, this, what I call her mea culpa tour. You hear her express it at the beginning of the film, that she's apprehensive about what she's going to encounter in Grenada. She spent some time in the south of the island with some students there, and the other person that you see in the video, a Grenadian academic, and made her BBC documentary that was broadcast in the United Kingdom. And one of the things that came from that was that Laura's family donated $100,000 to the University of the West Indies Reparations Committee. And in order for that $100,000 to be donated, the government of people of Grenada had to host her family in a lavish ceremony at the Trade Center. The Prime Minister was there, all of civil society was there. And one of the tensions that you see there is on the YouTube video itself. If you look at the YouTube video in the comment section, there's a comment of a Grenadian saying, she can easily check her ancestors, she can easily see how many slaves they owned, but I can't find my family tree, and I don't know where it sprang from. So that's one of the tensions that we see. And this is one of the tensions that is always at work within these colonial archives. And so one of the questions that I'm asking or thinking about in my project is, what exists outside the archives, what lives outside the archives. And if the archive contains silences, then we can ask where knowledge lives, especially in the context of the Caribbean. And one of the ways that I propose, or some of the ways that knowledge circulates in the Caribbean, is through everyday conversation, through gossip, through storytelling, through Caribbean landscapes, in burial grounds, in spiritual practice, in family memory, in performance, and in oral tradition. And these forms of knowledge may not appear in the archive, but they are archives of their own. And so in the Grenadian village, where most of my thinking comes from, the day often begins not with written records or formal archives, but with conversation across yards. Somebody would call out to my mother first thing in the morning, "Good morning." My mother goes out to our front porch and greets her neighbor. The way that my mother knows what's circulating in the village is through that initial morning conversation with her neighbor. Children are always also part of that circulation. Children are often playing in yards, playing in the road, heading to school. In these everyday exchanges, those moments of talk, of connection, of memory, and of rumor, history is constantly being reassembled. People remember who lived on which piece of land, whose grandfather worked what particular estate, which families migrated, which graves belonged to who, and who is buried under the old mango tree. None of this appears in the official colonial records, but it is a form of historical knowledge. And it is precisely this kind of relational, everyday knowledge that I think speculative storytelling helps us to take seriously. Speculation, in my formulation, does not mean inventing history. Instead, it means working carefully with the gaps and silences that the archive leaves behind. This kind of speculative storytelling allows us to ask, what relationships are missing from the record? What forms of knowledge circulate outside of written archives? And how might community remember what this archive does not preserve? It is a way of approaching history that acknowledges uncertainty, or, like Glissant would say, opacity, or partial knowledge, while taking community memory seriously. So in thinking the village as epistemology, as a site of knowledge-making, as a method, and as knowledge-making itself, I talk about how in many Caribbean contexts, knowledge circulates through village life. And if anybody here has lived in a village, and I see some of my good Grenadian friends in the audience, so I know that they know what I mean, everyday practices, such as the call and response conversation, the intergenerational transfer is still also very present in a Caribbean village. Children in Caribbean villages are always admonished to stay out of big people's business. And big people's business usually means that they're talking about something that's going on among the adults that has been transmitted, not formally, but as something that is overheard, and that's something that is interesting to young people. Elders are often correcting young people. One of the ways that I know that I'm at home in the village is because somebody will tell me something about how I'm dressed or how I look, or there will be some form of correction. There will be a way that I'm allowed to interact with my elders, that I'm supposed to know how to behave, that is part of sort of the knowledge making that the village gives us. Stories are the way that stories circulate in the village also is through these informal networks. For example, just this week I had some very bad news from home about somebody who had passed on, and the memorialization of that person has taken on a very specific village quality on Facebook, right? A very specific Caribbean village quality, where he's memorialized as somebody's son, somebody's father, as somebody who was this kind of person in relationship to village life as well. So that's one of the ways that this kind of knowledge making is transferred. And these practices are not mere social interaction. There are ways that we remember history and place and relation across generations. So rather than rejecting the archive, speculative methods invite us to place the archive in conversation with other forms of knowledge. For example, the archive may document the compensation paid to plantation owners, but village knowledge holds the family stories that are tied to those plantations. And so all of the 692 claims that exist within the UCL archives of place names that, I mean, everywhere, as we know, those of us who are from the Caribbean, place names are estate names for the most part, and plantation names. And so one of the biggest estates in Grenada, for example, Beauséjour. There's when you go into the archive, there's Beauséjour, there's who owned it, how much money they received at emancipation. But when you go to Beauséjour and you're in the village there and you're in conversation about, especially about the descendants of enslaved people, which for me is sort of the relational silence that the archive, especially an archive like UCL, sort of refuses, and also an archive that Laura Trevelyan refuses in her work as well. That idea that repair has to exist in relation to these histories, but also in relation to the present moment as well. That Beauséjour, or her family estates, which are mostly in Simoun, in Requin, are contemporary places in Grenada, and that the descendants of enslaved people that were owned by her family, there's a 50-50 chance, and knowing Grenada, there's maybe almost a 90% chance that the descendants of enslaved people still live there, and still, and are the ones who hold a memory and a knowledge of that history that typing her name into the UCL archives doesn't quite do. So how do we do the work of relational repair? Through family stories, through stories of landscape, through remembrances, through fragments of ancestral memory, is what I'm thinking about. And how does that operate as a kind of reparation in the sort of against the tradition that Laura proposes? So in the Caribbean, our sort of, the way that we've chosen to approach reparation is through CARICOM's 10-point plan. And it's a very, a well laid out, thoughtful plan that asks for things. I mean, you heard Laura at the beginning of that video say we can't get even the first one, which is a full and formal apology. And so it asks for a full and formal apology for British enslavement. It asks for repatriation of materials and artifacts away from the metropole and back into Caribbean spaces, for Indigenous peoples' development programs, for cultural institutional development as well, public health, to address public health crises that a lot of research says it draws a direct line between the plantation regime and sort of current public health crises in the Caribbean, illiteracy, education, all of those. And so in my work, I asked, of course, I'm grateful for this this framework for reparatory justice that's coming from CARICOM. It was unprecedented in its time. It's been taken up elsewhere. That I don't know how many of you read that long piece from Ta-Nehisi Coates that came out a few years ago called The Case for Reparations. A lot of advocacy work has been done on the part of CARICOM in the US and elsewhere, and some of the work that these folks are drawing on is coming straight from the work of CARICOM. And so we, of course, are grateful for that. However, in one of the ways that or one of the questions that I ask in my work is, how can speculative storytelling do the work of recovering what is absent from the archive, do the work of relational repair? In Laura Trevelyan's case, it's very easy to go into the archive, type in your name, see what's going on with your family, and then decide on a sort of individual hero's journey around what is in the archive. And so my question is, what repair for those voices that are silenced by these archives? What repair for the descendants of the enslaved? How can speculative storytelling in that case help us to reclaim those narratives, to repair relationships with the past, and to imagine futures beyond the colonial framework? Speculative storytelling that is cited in the village, in the Grenadian village, in the Caribbean village. How can it help us rethink how we approach archives and history? Instead of thinking of the archive as the only source of truth, can we teach ourselves and each other to ask, what is missing here? Can we live with opacity? Can we live with errancy, with knowing that not all of it will be known, and that's fine, that the not knowing is also part of the knowledge making, and asking whose knowledge is absent whenever we encounter these, especially in relationship to the Caribbean. If you've done any research on the Caribbean, you know that for many of us, the colonial archives are completely inaccessible, that it means taking a trip to London town, to queues, and most of us never make it there. And so if access is foreclosed in that way to the written record, then how do we recuperate our histories in that context? Whose knowledge is absent? And what other forms of memory may exist? And how do those forms of memory do the kind of relational work or the work of relational repair in a way that the colonial archive can't ever approximate? And so this approach asks us to live with opacity, to live with the uncertainty, to reinvent through imagination, not invention, but reinvention. How do we speculate a life in the archive that is silenced, a life that is a claim, a life that is data? And what does that do for the relational life of place in the Caribbean village? What does that do for reparations? How is that a certain kind of work of repair in that context? And so when I ask how we do work that feels like a village, it's not just a question about methodology. It's also about relationship, about relation and relational repair, about how we approach histories that have been fragmented by colonial violence, where there's still a work of repair that needs to be done, and how we engage with archives that are often recording exploitation, recording compensation in a mathematical calculus while silencing the life and the relation of the people who endured these ruptures. The colonial archive gives us a certain kind of evidence, but Caribbean village communities hold something else, memories and work of relation. They hold memory in landscapes, in family stories, in everyday talk, in bushgram, in shushuin, in talking by the side, in saying that is not your business, that is big people business, or I'm not getting involved in little children melee. They hold memories that never appear in the official records. One of the things that I put often in my writing is, don't look for this word in the dictionary. because it's, again, it's very situational and very specific to a site. Even in my own work, which some of it I do in Grenadian patois, I guess you would say, some of it I write straight up in indecipherable to the academy, Grenadian patois. I say, this is not even specific to the Grenadian village. This is specific to where I am from in Grenada. So my good friend Karen, who's sitting at the front here, is from the south and I'm from the north, and we have two very different village registers of speech. And so for me, even that carries its own sort of methodological claim to say that the way that I choose to be in relationship to knowledge is through that very specific sort of language and dialect. And so these practices carry historical knowledge across generations, and speculative storytelling invites us to work carefully within that space and between what the archive can prove and what communities know and remember. And in doing so, this allows us to imagine forms of scholarship that are not only analytical, but also reparatory, forms of knowledge that reconnect fragments of history, that honor voices that were excluded from official records, and that open us onto possibilities about how we can think about justice and the future. Just earlier on, just before this conversation began, I was in a conversation with the Badewa about the work that I do and how I've chosen to approach my PhD through a very specific method and methodology. And one of the things that always happens whenever I give a talk at Concordia is that people come up to me and ask, they say, I'm going to look for your work. This was great, I'm going to look for your work. And I always say, well, you'll have to go and look for it in Grenada, because that's where it is. It's not really online. It's only online when I come and sit here and talk about it. And so that, again, is a very specific epistemological choice that I've made. It's a methodological choice that I've made about where I think from and with. And so I believe that holds possibility for the way that we can do work and scholarship and research as well. And so in many ways, this project that I'm doing, I hope can, and I think resonates with the call of Black Studies at Concordia. Black Studies has always asked us not just to recover histories, but to rethink how knowledge itself is produced. And so if we think that knowledge is produced in the village and that the village is its own epistemology, how does that help us to do that kind of work here? Enjoy some beautiful pictures of the village that I took while I was, you will always get Caribbean skies and seas. You got beautiful coral reefs from Dr. Smith, and now you're getting beautiful village children and village landscapes from me. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Tesfa Peterson, for that presentation, and Dr. Nicola Smith. We're going to the next section of the program, which is a Q&A. So the floor is open for questions. Oui.
My question is for Tesfa. Also, thank you very much, both of you, for your presentations. Sorry, I'm a little bit quiet. My question is for Tesfa, and it's actually about whether your work is in relation with Saidia Hartman's critical fabulation, because as you were speaking, I was thinking about her book, Wayward Lives. I forget the other half of the title, but Beautiful Experiments. Yeah, Beautiful Experiments. And like how, when I read that book, I was like, oh my gosh, this is insane. Like, this is exactly the kind of textual richness that I feel like Black archival work has, but sometimes is not quite readily translated over into literature. So yeah, curious about your connection with her work, Critical Fabulation.
Thank you for that question. I would say that as Black diasporic work, yes, as a sort of Black diasporic thinking, but I specifically cite my lineage within Caribbean intellectual traditions. And in fact, a lot of the work that I'm doing is inspired by the work of Merle Collins, who is a Grenadian scholar and thinker and post-colonial writer. And she has done this kind of work that called speculative fiction or speculative storytelling in a few of her works now. Angel, which was a sort of speculative fiction in relationship to the events of October 1983 in Grenada, post the Grenada Revolution. There's another book of hers called The Color of Forgetting, and her most recent work coming out in 2023, Ocean Stirrings, is really sort of at the heart of what I'm thinking about in my project more than anything else. This is sort of a side quest of my PhD. So Ocean Stirrings is a book of fiction on speculating the life of Helen Louise Little, who is a Grenadian woman, historical figure from the village of LaDigue in Grenada, and who is also the mother of Malcolm X and his 7 siblings. And so the work that I'm doing globally in my PhD is more connected to that tradition there, and connected to her latest work on so that is a question that I have had to think about. How am I in relationship sort of to the broader of Black studies? And I've chosen very deliberately to stay with the Caribbean side of things. And even more like stubbornly, specifically to the Grenadian side of things. Yeah, thank you. MERLE, and yes, if you will allow me to plug, she's coming to Concordia on April 23rd for a full-day symposium here at the Fourth Space. So if you want to hear more about that, you're welcome to come then. Mm-hmm.
I would just like to remind those joining us on Zoom, I see we have some people chatting and being happy. I just want to make sure that you know you can use the chat to ask questions, and we will be sure to read them out, as well as if you would like to ask a question using your voice and video, please raise your virtual hand and we will prompt you accordingly.
This is, I mean, in a way it's probably more of a comment than it is a question, but I would really be interested in hearing, you know, whatever it provokes for you. For both of you, I mean, for Tesfa it's clearer, but Nicola, you also have, I mean, you talked about the whole proportion of unreported information, yeah, whether it's the lost catches or, you know, and others. And so there is something about, there are all the scientific methods to gain that information, but there are no doubt, because we are also talking about the Caribbean, there's talking to the fishermen, there's, you know, and I'm just interested as well in that all of that quote unquote unofficial information, accessing it, how, you know, like how you work with it, how you go get it, how it is, you know, before you actually get to the place where you're transforming it into a graph with X and Y, which you need to do in order to do the rest of the work, but just how you're engaging with, in a way, the storytelling, right? The stories, the gossip, the shushu, the, you know, I mean, that's how you know. If I think in terms of turbot, for example, in Jamaica, which is actually called trash fish, and it's not, I mean, many people don't eat it because of the skin is black. So it's caught and it's trash fish, you throw it back in the water, when in fact, it's excellent, you know what I mean? But those are all stories that are perpetuated and have an impact on behavior, but then also on numbers, you know, quantification, etc.
So actually, the reconstruction used a variety of data sources. One which actually talks to Tesfa was, like I said, the British colonial reports, and true to what she said, I actually accessed those archives at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. But I did go to the Bahamas, and I went to the archives there as well to see what I can get. And from there, I got a lot of the newspaper clippings, for instance. So for the fishing of sharks in the Bahamas, I remember I was talking to one researcher, and they were saying something to the effect of, oh, they didn't really fish sharks that much in the past. And then I show a newspaper clipping with a fisherman from Spanish Wells that has something like 30 sharks in the background that he's caught, and how some of these things were caught for curios for the jaws and this sort of thing. And so I said, actually, yes, they did, and here's a record of it in the newspaper. You see this picture of this fisherman with these sharks. And what I also did was, for instance, when I quantified subsistence fishing that was in there, what I had to do is you had to do some interviews, but you had to put it in the language that people understand. So instead of saying, did you eat 2 kilograms of fish a week? You can't say that. No one knows what that means. But I know how much weight a plate-sized snapper is. A snapper is a very common type of fish we eat in the Bahamas. And if you say a plate-sized snapper, everyone knows what a plate-sized snapper is. I know what that weight is I say, how many plate-sized snappers would you eat within a week to feed your family? And when they give me that answer, then I translate that into a number. And so it was things like that. And then also, so some of it was putting things in a language people speak and relate to. Other things were actually getting kind of creative with the sport fishing. How I was able to recreate some of the sports fishing, because it's not recorded, was you had to go through different sources. So the Ministry of Tourism in the Bahamas is incredibly powerful, because tourism makes up 51% of the GDP. And they record everything. So I went into their archives, I looked at, they have these visitor exit surveys, and on these surveys they record what were you doing in the Bahamas on your vacation. And in that, people will tick off sport fishing. And so I looked through those surveys and was able to calculate what percentage of the people coming to the Bahamas engaged in sport fishing. Then I go back to the Ministry of Tourism, I look at, they keep records of the total number of tourists that came to the Bahamas each year on the different islands. And the type of activity you engage in is very specific to whether you're in the capital in Nassau and the city areas, or for what we call the family out islands, which is more remote, like rural areas. And so they separate it to that level. So I'm able to capture what percentage of people fish if they went to the family islands versus if they were in the capital. Then from there, so okay, so now I know how many fishers there are, because they just say, each year how many came, what percentage of those are fishing. Then I need to know, okay, well, what did they capture? So then for this, what we do is the Bahamas has per capita catch limits on different species that you're allowed to capture in the Bahamas for tourists. So it's regulated, but it's not reported. So it's not, so people know what the limits are, but when I speak to anyone in the tourism industry, as well as to the director of fisheries, I had a really good relationship with the fisheries department there. They all say, not just in the Bahamas, but throughout the Caribbean, that people overcatch, far exceed the catch limits because there's no enforcement of that law. So what I said, okay, let's be conservative, and let's say that every tourist in the Bahamas that engaged in fishing, which is only about 8% of people or whatever, caught 80% of what they're legally allowed to capture. So these are giving us conservative estimates of what you wrote into your law, how many fish they're able to take. And by doing that, and then of course the legislation changed over time when they felt that too much fish was coming out, no data, mind you. No data to say how many fish were coming out the water. But somehow they felt that maybe too many fish were coming out of the water from tourism, so they lowered the catch limits again for per capita catch limits, like basically track the different legislations and adjusted accordingly. And then I was able to show them, listen, based on your legislation, this is how much fish you're allowing people to take, and these are conservative estimates because there's no enforcement. And the director of fisheries was astounded when I showed him the numbers. He literally went like this. He was like, I knew it was a lot, but I had no idea it was that much. because no one had actually sat down and said, let's just go based on the law. What you said people are allowed to take. Let's really count that up and see what that really translates to mathematically. So yeah, it was a lot of going around. And they also estimated, I'll stop here, but tourist consumption of fisheries, so not just through sports fishing, but also direct consumption in hotel restaurants. And how I did this was I went around to all the big hotels in the Bahamas, big and small, and I spoke to the hotel purchasing managers or the head chefs of the restaurants and the hotels. And I asked them, do you have records of how much fish you stock your restaurants with and whether they're local or imported? They have these records because they have to keep them to say how much money they're going to spend each year in terms of what type of fish they're going to buy, who they buy them from. So all I had to do was get these records from them, which they keep. And then what I did, I went to the Ministry of Tourism again, and for each one of these hotels, they have hotel occupancy rates for each time period. So then I say, okay, 1993, December, look at the book, how many fish did you order during that time? And then I said, what was the hotel occupancy rate at that time? How many people could actually be in a hotel at a time? Multiply that out, and you get a per capita consumption rate. So you just have to be really creative about the data sources that are available to you and see how that translates into some sort of numerical, quantifiable entity.
The creativity really gets that for me is what is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And that I see as a connection to the creativity piece is really, I mean, that's my craft as well, but that's for me it really is this the idea that by the time we get to the knowledge, quote unquote, that we're reading, what has made that possible is the creativity behind it in terms of what is constituting that knowledge and how do we access it and how do we translate it or transpose it in a way from one context to the other, you know?
I should point out too that with that data, when I published this paper, I had a really long table where you made explicit every assumption you made at every step of the way for every data point to say, we assume per capita catch rate was this, and then you have the citation to say based on this citation, whether it was through interviews with fishermen or whatever, or whether it was through hotel records, so you can literally go back for every data point and say, what assumptions went into creating this data point?
Okay.
Sorry, thank you both so much for such wonderful presentations. I love the fact that we have like science on the left and like what I consider like art and creativity and culture on the right. I identify with the science side, but I think both were very interesting because I would have never thought about what is absent in documentation. So I think this is very valuable work. My question is for you, Dr. Smith. I would just like to know, what is the ultimate intention of the work that you're doing? What do you want to see come out of this from a national perspective in Bahamas and globally?
So basically, I have a two-prong approach. First is to understand, describe, and quantify the impacts of climate change and predict what's going to happen with climate change in the Bahamas and wider Caribbean. And then the second approach is to say, how can we build resilience to some of these impacts that we're predicting? And so, for instance, I have some students going to the Bahamas this summer, some graduate students, and so I do a lot of work about climate change, and I've shown in some studies that where literally I spoke to them this morning about doing some calculations for publication, and what we looked at was coral bleaching and how coral bleaching is basically when it gets really hot, the coral expels these algae that live in their tissue, and then it turns white and it dies. If it stays like that for too long, it literally starves to death. So what we wanted to do is say there is some knowledge that came out of the Pacific, particularly around the Great Barrier Reef, that there are these particular fish that associate with coral, and that they found that during marine heat waves, coral that had these type of fish, they didn't bleach as much, they had lower mortality rates, they had higher growth rates, and they had better recovery rates. And so it was, well, what is it about this fish that is changing the outcome from a mass bleaching event from our marine heat wave? And they think it came through two mechanisms with this fish. One is this behavior, it's a territorial fish, so what they do is they farm little algal gardens on the reef. So you think that's a bad thing because they're growing algae on top of the coral. But they're very territorial, so they actually chase away every single fish that tries to get at this garden. But by doing that, they're chasing away coral predators as well. And so what happens is at a time when coral predation happens, it basically decreases the likelihood that you're going to recover from a stressful event like a marine heat wave, because it's an added stress upon a stress. And so they found that this reduction in coral predation was actually helping the corals to be more resilient to climate change. And so what my students are doing, they only know this for a few species in the Pacific. What we're doing is we're doing this in the Bahamas, and the first thing we're doing, we're just going to look at these reefs that have the fish, and first of all, document all the different types of fish that go there. And then what she's going to do as a master's student, she's going to remove half of the fish from those reefs. We have little GoPro cameras, and then we record coral predation on these reefs in the presence versus in the absence of these fish to say, do these fish do indeed reduce coral predation rates? That is hypothesized, but there's no empirical data to show this. And then another student, a PhD student, another pathway by which this comes through is the pee and poop of this fish. So when a fish pees and poops, because it's really close to the reef, it releases nitrogen, which is really important for coral. And it releases nitrogen in the form of ammonia, which is more easy for the coral to uptake than it is nitrite, which is like NO3, which is available in ocean water. So basically it produces nitrogen in a more accessible form. And so the coral are able to take in this nitrogen from the fish pee and poop, and this allows them to grow and to better withstand climate shocks like a marine heat wave. And so she's going to have a whole bunch of tanks, and we're going to grow some coral in there. We're going to simulate marine heat waves. We're going to put fish in there. We're actually going to measure nitrogen uptake and these sorts of things to say, can we show the mechanism by which this happens, but not just for this species. We're saying there's another species in the Caribbean we think might be doing an even better job at this than what they've studied in the Pacific. So we're going to compare it with these other fish that are local to the Caribbean and say, are these valuable as well? Are these building resistance to these climate shockers like marine heat waves? So that's ideally where I'm going with my work. It's to first understand what's happening, predict what's happening, and then with those predictions, how can we build resilience to these threats?
Thank you so much. Ms. Peterson, my question is for you. In terms of, you talk about keeping your work very local to Grenada, I was just wondering in terms of the thought of influencing other Caribbean scholars to do similar work in their countries, because I think this is still very valuable information and I wouldn't want it to be locked away in one place.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm here in the metropole of metropoles at a colonial institution sharing about it. So, and it's on YouTube. And my mother is on YouTube, which is always very important for me. And so it's not locked away precisely, but before my academic career at Concordia, before this iteration of my academic career, I had a bit of an academic career going at Queen's University as well. And one of the things I learned in a class by Catherine McKittrick is that citation is a politics. And the way we cite, C-I-T-E, and cite, S-I-T-E, is really important to me methodologically. And so there are places and spaces, for example, again, this presentation today is really, really the side quest of my PhD. What I do mostly and what I have done for the last 7 years or so is what I would call public, well, for the sake of the PhD work, public humanities work. And one aspect of that work is a public education series. So we've had since 2019, which was inaugurated in the village community of LaDigue in Grenada by a presentation by Dr. Merle Collins, where she did the Emancipation Lecture on the life and legacy of Helen Louise Langdon, as I mentioned earlier, and took that work to the village, to the primary school there, and had an exhibit. And since I attended that talk in 2019, I became involved in the work that was ongoing there with an organization in Grenada, a grassroots organization called the Institute for People's Enlightenment. And shout out to them, they're also on YouTube and on Zoom. And through the work of the Institute for People's Enlightenment, one of the arms of the work is public education and sort of popular education in a revolutionary tradition. And so what that work does is that it bridges community members into institutions like the university. Our last talk, for example, we had a professor from the University of Chicago at Urbana-Champaign, Dr. Eric McDuffie, who was one of the foremost thinkers around the life of Helen Louise Langdon. We've had Dr. Merle Collins. I've had my own PhD supervisor, Dr. Nalini Mohabir, David Austin, and many others have been part of that public lecture series. It's a public webinar that we have every year around the commemoration of Malcolm X's birthday. And so we do that work with the stated intention of bridging those divides that don't really exist but that we make up, right? And so in that way, if you type in IPE Grenada on Facebook, there I am, you know, for the last 6 years, talking about the work that we're doing in community. So in that way, I would say the work is cited in very specific ways in Grenada, but also is very accessible and available, and I'm sure you can tell from all these chit-chats here that I'm happy to talk about it. I'm happy to talk about how we do it. You know, I'm happy, like you said, to be in the company of a scientist from the Caribbean whose work is under the sea in the Bahamas. Like that's beautiful, and that's all of the ways that we do it, and even while we're here, so. Mm-hmm.
There are other questions? Questions? Yes.
Just out of curiosity, what, over the course of the 7 years of doing this work in LaDigue, in community, what has shifted, if anything? You know what I mean? Like how, yeah, what does it mean for them?
Mm-hmm. So I'm not from LaDigue. That's my first declaration. I'm from an entirely different village in Grenada called Chantimelle. There's Chantimelle people on the chat too, so hi. And one of the things that is very important to me then in that context is to think about how I fit into what is a community-driven process. And I think I've been conscripted into the village of LaDigue by now. I think they would say that I'm one of them now. But the way that I came into the process was really to support something that was already underway in the community. And so my offering to them was my expertise as a researcher, also in very Caribbean ways. You know, somebody needs to cook up a lot of food. Somebody needs to be a researcher. We all kind of have our roles. And so that's what I've been able to, and through that, and I'll say it here publicly, also to think about how the resources that are available to me here can also be transmitted to those communities. And so it's an ongoing work of thinking about how we link communities to resources, resources that have to do with knowledge-making practices, resources that have to do with mentorship. One of the things that we've done over the course of years is, and this year, this last lecture, which happened in February, I think we're right at the place where my face no longer needs to appear on the lecture series. So I think we've mentored enough community members into the work that they are now driving the process. And so over time, my role has diminished in that way, but not in the sense of supporting whatever work is happening in the community. So from September to January, September last year to January of this year, I spent 4 months with the students at the primary school there, the primary school that Helen Louise attended, to support work that was ongoing there. Some days it looked like boring 10 and 12-year-olds with stories of the past. They will tell you that they're bored. And sometimes it meant being the MC for concerts that were happening at the school. It meant raising funds from the Black Perspectives Office here to give to the work of the school. It meant also coming out of pocket to support the work of the steel band there as well. And so that's kind of the role that I see myself playing in that work.
Okay, thank you, Tesfa, for that. I think relating to what you discussed, as an historian, I actually can understand that archives actually are just colonial discussions about the past. And I think that's why oral history is becoming a very big thing now, where we can actually discuss about gossip, body gestures, silence, memories, memoryscapes, landscapes, and all these kind of like, we use this elements to compare and contrast the stories we meet or we encounter at the archives. And I found this really interesting. The fact that you spoke about village life, which is, I think that's one aspect of research now that is becoming really popular, where the voice of the village is being represented, not just the voice of the knowledgeable ones. So I think introducing...
Well, this is the voice of the village here, so the voice of the village and the voice of the knowledgeable ones is one and the same.
So I appreciate your presentation. I appreciate your presentation, and Dr. Smith. I don't know if there are other questions from the audience or online. Are there questions online? No. Right. Okay. So.
Can I just say to you, Nicola, to Dr. Smith, how amazing it is to see someone so passionate about the work that they do. I'm really I don't know anything about marine biology, but I feel like I can from your presentation, so it's great. It's great. Thank you so much.
So thank you for being here. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for answering the questions that were posted to you. We'll be having this, the 5th series for this, coming up in April too. And we're going to be having, the panel is going to be, we're going to be infusing Black scholarship into how, the panel is probably going to be discussing how we include Black scholarship into the curriculum. And the panel is going to include faculties, grad students, and librarians. And this is happening on April 2nd. And you're all welcome to join us again for that series. We appreciate your time. And thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you again to all of our panelists for your presentations. Thank you to the audience for your questions. This was wonderful. And thank you to our moderator and the organizers. We're going to go ahead, close up that Zoom and live stream now, but just a quick reminder that this conversation is already available on our YouTube channel if you wish to revisit or share it. As mentioned, please do join us here again on April 2nd for the last installment of the winter semester for this speaker series. We hope to see you soon and have a wonderful weekend.